create something.
Hi everyone, welcome back to those of you that have joined us for previous sessions and welcome to our new participants. I am Jatin Yadav, the Regional Innovation Hub Manager for Water and Energy for Food USAID unit of the Secretariat. I'm excited to introduce today's session, Same Mission, Different Solutions, Securing Water for Food and Powering Agriculture Grand Challenge Views on Technical Assistance and Innovation Scaling. A few housekeeping items before we move on to the actual session. This session is being recorded and will be uploaded to the V4F website and YouTube channel. Those who are not comfortable with this should feel free to leave the session. There is a Q&A box on the right-hand side. You can submit your questions and comments in the Q&A box throughout the session, and we'll answer them in the Q&A portion of today's session. You have the option of submitting your questions anonymously as well. Note that we may not get to all of your questions and we will upload detailed responses to the unanswered questions on our website. All sessions will be in English. Simultaneous transcription in French and Arabic is available. To turn on these live captions and subtitles, please select caption subtitles on using the closed caption icon in your video control. To change the caption language, select settings icon and then caption subtitles to choose your preferred language. Written transcriptions will also be available after the event. All right, moving on. Securing water for food and powering agriculture are two different grand challenges that had one mission: to decrease natural resource usage while increasing agricultural yields. However, the two programs differed in their approach. And today's panel features technical assistance facilitators and USAID team leaders from both the programs for a discussion on why and how they chose different approaches and the lessons learned in the process. We will start with a presentation on the acceleration models and lessons learned from Securing Water for Food team. Then we'll move on to the Powering Agriculture Grand Challenge team, followed by a moderated discussions with our speakers, where I'll ask a few questions to them, and then we will close with the audience Q&A. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce you to our first speakers, Dr. Koo McMahon and Kevin Hayes. Dr. Koo is the USAID team lead for Water and Energy for Food program and former team lead of Securing Water for Food. Kevin is the senior partnerships advisor and former acceleration specialist for Securing Water for Food. Over to you, Kevin.
Next slide. And so some of you have seen this slide before if you saw some of our earlier conversations. So we talked about the circular process and how you go from one step to another. But today we're really focusing in on that acceleration support, the technical assistance, and the need and the use of the acceleration work plan and how we set and modify targets towards milestones with Innovators. One of the things you'll also hear a little bit later from Augusta and her team is the difference in how they use targets and milestones versus how we use them. And so Kevin's going to do much of the talking here today, but the key takeaway message is that having a focus point where the innovator comes into the program with some clear understanding of what they think they can do, and then reality will alter both what they think they're able to do and what the program thinks they're able to do. And we did that in a kind of a back and forth collaborative process. With at some points the program saying, no, this is the minimum we'll take, and other points saying, okay, yeah, there was a flood or a drought, and we clearly understand why you needed to shift. Next slide, please. And so from our perspective, we had 4 primary lines of support. One of them was the SWFF Technical Assistance Facility team managed by Kaizen. Then there was USAID and its network and partners, where we sometimes reached out to them for support. And then the next one was the Technical Assistance Facility Consortium. And then finally, niche providers. So we had our rapid vendor mechanism, which was around the world, where we would reach out to them. And so depending upon how aligned the support needed to be, which one was most cost effective, which one we could do quickest, and previous awardee feedback on service delivery is how we chose the different lines of support. Next slide, please.
Yes, our process for contracting with vendors to deliver a scope of work was designed for speed and efficiency. Startup circumstances change rapidly, as we all know, and we had to be able to deliver on their time scale. So we went through a process of pre-qualifying vendors to be able to deliver in specific support types. A scope of work was released only to vendors pre-qualified in the relevant support type. And because vendors were pre-qualified, the response to a specific scope of work could be kept to a minimum set of questions, which reduced the time a vendor had to take to respond and also reduced the time it took for the team to assess and review proposals. So as a result, the time from writing the scope of work to the vendor selected and being engaged on the project could be as little as 4 weeks. Next slide, please. So we were delivering in 21 distinct service categories. Primarily, these were covered by the vendors. Once the vendors received their pre-qualification for the RVPM, they could submit proposals for any call within their pre-qualified areas. So by the end of the program, SWFF had engaged 35 vendors based all over the world, with 14 having local experience and 21 being non-local. So in our definition, non-local would be vendors based in the US or Europe. So by the end of the program, all vendor engagements actually were being delivered by local vendors, which we saw as quite an achievement. Next slide, please. So our process for planning the acceleration support was pretty robust. Working from the bottom of the pyramid up, it was based on defining a set of milestone targets for which an awardee was held accountable to continue year to year in the program. And success against those targets had to be supported by evidence. So they had to bring a plan for that evidence gathering. We used a needs diagnostic, which highlighted gaps in the awardees, both operational and strategic areas that would potentially limit their ability to scale and put them at risk of hitting their targets. And then we had a support call with the awardee, which reviewed the targets relative to the operational and strategic gaps identified and put a support plan in place to address any risk areas. So once USAID had approved both the targets and the plan to address those gaps, the support was then scoped and delivered to the awardee. Next slide, please. So this slide really shows the breadth of the support types that we delivered, as well as where they concentrated. So you can see from a breadth standpoint, we delivered anything from sales and marketing strategies to business model strategies to gender monitoring and evaluation, legal advisory, just a plethora of different areas. But you can see where they concentrated, kind of in those top 6 well, really the top 5, from sales and marketing down to gender. You can see the highest concentration was in the sales and marketing area. Next slide, please. So the TA facility tracks several metrics to make sure the support we provided was having an impact. So we looked at the innovators' overall satisfaction with each support engagement, and then asked them to tell us to what extent they'd recommend the support provider to other SWFF innovators. So we use these metrics to make any necessary course corrections, both to improve support delivery processes, as well as the quality of the support delivered. So the chart you're looking at here shows the long-term value of the support delivered. So we went back to innovators 6 months to a year after they had received support and asked them if it had made a valuable difference to them. So we wanted to know if the support had lasting impacts, such as informing a business model change or improving sales conversion rates, or leading to more investor interest. So you can see there was quite an improvement from the first year to the last year. Next slide. So we also tracked an innovator's overall satisfaction with the support delivered. So we were looking for a score here of at least 4 out of 5. And over time, we could see the support strengths of the TA facility given the vendors that were in our provider network. So 2 of the strongest support offerings were in business model development and sales and marketing. And we had delivered quite a few of these, a lot of these, and the score stayed high throughout the program. So these were some clear strengths of our program based on our bench of providers. And you can see, especially in the ones that scored above a 4, that we considered these some of our strongest areas. Next slide.
And so now we're going to talk about some of the lessons learned from that technical assistance. The first and most important for our program was that the money alone wasn't enough to help the innovation scale. They needed the technical assistance. Some of them were new to working with USAID, and they just needed basic technical assistance even to work on how to get our funds and to be able to document it and strengthen their organizations. Some came with strong organizations, but didn't have the business model or technical assistance or capacity developed already to be able to take it to wide scale adoption. But in every case, we had, if we'd just given them the money, we would not have seen the levels of scale and success. Hopefully that will change in the future, but at least for now, that is definitely the case. Next slide, please. The other thing that's really important is that the innovators' financial systems were often very nascent, if at all developed. Some of them didn't have an accountant. Some of them had just very shallow books. And so we had to work with them to create strong financial systems, strong financial flows and processes, accounts receivable, payments, etc., which they could then take, in some cases, even online to support online payments. But without that, they didn't know where the money was coming from or where the money was going. And it made it highly unlikely that anyone would ever want to invest in them. And so that was extremely important to the program to at least get them to the base space there and then let them grow and expand. Kevin?
And next slide, please. So this lesson learned was really around kind of the operations of how we rolled out support. So we would have multiple scopes of work that were being delivered to a single innovator at any given time. And at any given time, the TA facility was delivering support to up to 20 or so innovators. So the processes and trackers that we put in place were really key to tracking both the status of the scope of work being delivered to ensure timeliness and quality of the end result. It was quite a lot to juggle, so those trackers were key to making sure we were on track. Next slide. So this lesson learned was really about pushing solutions as close to the innovator as possible, so providing more localized solutions. So in the first year of the program, support was delivered primarily through 3 vendors based primarily in the United States. One had some offices overseas, but primarily they were based in the US. We quickly realized that the variation of expertise that was going to be necessary to address innovator gaps was broader than these 3 vendors could provide. Additionally, SWFF Innovators placed a higher value on support providers that at least had firsthand knowledge of the unique challenges of working in an emerging market, if in fact they didn't bring specific knowledge of a specific marketplace. In years 2 and 3 of the program, the TA facility made a strong effort to work with support providers that brought that local context. And as an outcome, innovators felt more comfortable with the services received, and we saw overall satisfaction with the support increase. Next slide.
And so this was a key lesson learned for the program. In several cases in the first year, there were mismatches between the expected outputs or outcomes from the acceleration support engagements and the actual outcomes. And so we had to change some processes to make sure that would work. And so in year 2, some of those changes were we reduced the potential for misunderstandings and increased the specificity of the expected outputs from the engagement by being more specific in both the communications and the documentation around the scope of work, around the acceleration provision, including the expected time and effort commitment. In addition, the process was now defined not only what was expected from the support provider, but what was expected from the innovator themselves. And over time, with these changes, everything wasn't perfect, but we had significantly fewer misunderstandings, and the expectations were all aligned. Thank you.
Thank you, Ku and Kevin, for the insightful presentation and sharing lessons learned from SWFF's technical assistance approach. I think it's time to now go deep and see how Powering Agriculture did on their technical assistance approach. So I would now like to welcome our Powering Agriculture Grand Challenge speakers. Augusta Bramsey and Laura Sampath. Augusta is the program manager for Powering Agriculture and is an energy specialist in USAID's energy division. Laura is the vice president for programs at VentureWell. From 2015 to 2019, Laura led VentureWell's efforts to provide business advisory services for the Powering Agriculture portfolio of Innovators. Over to you both.
Thanks, Jatin. This is Augusta, so you'll be able to recognize our voices as we go through. So I'm excited to talk to you about Powering Agriculture's approach to technical assistance. There's a lot of similarities with the Securing Water for Food approach, but some differences as well. So first of all, why provide technical assistance? Who went into this? And Kevin went into this some a bit. But for us, I think the technical assistance really reflects Powering Agriculture's theory of change and some of the underlying assumptions around the development hypothesis. And the first one is that Powering Agriculture was set up to attract new and non-traditional partners. We really wanted to cast a wide net and work with players who had never worked with USAID before. And this means that they probably have no idea how to manage a USAID award, what it entails, what compliance entails, and they need quite a bit of support to do that. Secondly, the theory of change reflected for Powering Agriculture reflected the idea that sustainability and impact would be achieved through commercial growth of these endeavors. So in many cases, innovators started out at a stage of technology development, but over time, the hope was they would develop a business around the technology, and through a sustainable business, they would be able to sell their product and get it on the market and really distribute it to a wide range of players, and that is what would end up with the development impact. And so there was a lot of work in many cases around supporting innovators getting from a technology to an actually commercializable product and a business to make that happen. Finally, we had the idea that follow-on investment was going to be key for doing this. So we're giving a little bit of grant money, but to really take these innovations to scale, we'll need to attract private sector capital as well. And so a lot of the applicants were technologists, and investors would really like to see well-rounded organizations that have a range of business and market skills beyond just the technology development skills. So I alluded to this before. Next slide, please. The structure for project technical assistance was twofold. So we had delivered by Tetra Tech. We had a series of offerings around gender integration, contract compliance, which is very important, engineering, environmental compliance, and monitoring and evaluation. And then the business development and the business technical assistance was delivered through the Powering Agriculture Accelerator, and that focused on things like fundraising strategy, organizational strategy, market research, product commercialization. And then finally, Powering Agriculture in the last couple years implemented the Powering Agriculture Investment Alliance, which really brought impact investors into the process of delivering TA and hopefully got them in at an earlier stage. So in that approach, we had one impact investing partner that delivers both pre and post investment assistance, post-investment technical assistance, and another that has a very hands-on approach post-investment to supporting in market development and follow-on funding. And so these were our three different strategies around delivering technical assistance. So next slide, please, and I'm going to hand it over to Laura.
Good morning, everyone, or afternoon or evening. So I was going to take a couple minutes just to talk a little bit about how we approach the support for the innovators. One thing that Augusta has mentioned that was interesting about this portfolio is there was a combination of innovators who were selected for early stage technology development and research and development as a stage, as well as a portion of the portfolio that was focused on market expansion. So we, as we came in to work with the portfolio, faced a really interesting and unique challenge around how to design an intervention that could address the needs of both kinds of innovator sets. So we used our venture development framework. This is a tool that VentureWell has developed over 25 years, working with hundreds of early stage science and technology innovators. And we believe that these 6 dimensions that you see here, so team, technology, intellectual property, market, business model, and resources are the key components to a successful market strategy. We, in each of these dimensions, the milestones have innovators have, or each dimension has milestones where we're tracking innovators as they enter the milestone and as they exit the milestone. Next slide. So in the way that we worked was a little bit different than the securing water for food, but there were a lot of kind of underlying similarities and things that I think around the theory of changes, as Augusta was just mentioning, are quite aligned. So we went with a portfolio manager strategy where we had 2 dedicated portfolio managers who have a background in investment in clean tech and ag tech. And so that was they came in with a expertise in investment. They were able to conduct regular check-in calls, triage for needs around business strategy, what investors, if appropriate, it was likely to be connected with, and then the coaching that innovators would need in order to be successful. And we did several embedded technical assistance site visits to the geographies where innovators were working. 3 in-person accelerator workshops, which brought the entire cohort together and designed a curriculum around that experience. Several cohort calls and webinars where we designed either along technology or along sort of stage, where we were able to bring in smaller group discussions over the course in the arc of the 3 years. And then we produced several guides on securing and providing financing for companies. Next slide. I'm just going to quickly show you this, and I know these recordings will be available soon. This is some of the results that we achieved through the program. So, over 400 instances of technical assistance. We've really focused on referrals and partnerships because we understand that in order for technologies to last and scale into sustainable businesses, these are critical components of strategy. I mentioned some of these stats already. So innovator interactions, guides, et cetera. And then critically important, the funds mobilized by innovators was nearly $70 billion US. Next. And this is just another slice at some of those results. So technical assistance that we, and I think Kevin had this displayed a little differently alongside the securing water for food impact, but if you look at the kinds of instant technical assistance that we were most frequently offering, it was a combination of fundraising, business model, product market fit. And I'm going to keep us moving on because I know we're running short of time. So back over to you, Augusta.
Thanks. Next slide, please. So to wrap up, I'm just going to end giving 2 examples of the sorts of technical assistance that we provided. So the first instance is with SunCulture. So they were a very successful innovator with us. But this just emphasizes when an innovator applied, they ended up with, in most cases, a milestone-based award that lasted 3 years. And that milestone award-based award corresponded to their perceived business plan for the next 3 years. So SunCulture's award was around market expansion in different countries. And they had a certain thought process for how that would go. But about 1.5 years into their award, they decided that they needed to change the countries. Their underlying business strategy was changing. They were questioning a B2C model, going to more of a distributor-based model, and in general, lots of things where it's unrealistic to expect that a young and growing business has everything mapped out perfectly for the next 3 years in a way that can rigidly adhere to USAID's typical program structure. And so to help us both be responsive to their needs and allow them to have a flexible award, we engaged with a very detailed back and forth around a milestone modification plan and a modification to the award, where I think it really helped them both think through their business strategy and also make award adjustments so that the award can be responsible and flexible to their needs. Next slide. So the second case study is more along the business side of things. So the University of Toronto was developing a very specific technology to support increased yields in fish farms in Bangladesh. And with their award with us, there was at sort of an inflection point. So they had the principal investigator was a university researcher and had a great idea, but was basically pretty happy in her job. She was a tenured professor, very good at teaching, very good at research. She knew how to get publications and was not really interested in a new job of commercializing a technology. And so we find that this is often a sticking point for university-based innovators. What is the next step from getting their technology out of the lab to have it become actually a viable business that's marketed and sold and disseminated to users? And so we pushed them from early on to try to think about what that would actually look like. And so she was able to involve and interest some of her graduate students in that process. And so they were in the process of already applying to some business plan competitions. But over the course of their award, they had really focused on proving the technology. And so with them, we engaged in on-the-ground technical assistance project where we really worked with them to get a better handle on their business model. So this included doing a better job of calculating the total unit cost of their product, including distribution costs and marketing costs and all the other soft costs involved, and to inform their pricing strategy, defining customer archetypes so that they had a much better understanding of who they're going to try to sell to, developing a working financial model with sales and adoption assumptions, and then conducting a competitor analysis and a competition strategy. And so with these as inputs, they were then able to go ahead and refine their applications to a number of these competitions, and were successful in, for instance, winning the Aquaculture Innovation Challenge. And so our hope with this is that this new team has gotten some additional resources that they can really go ahead and take the next step to having a commercial endeavor. I'd like to emphasize that there's still a lot of questions, that the road to commercialization is a long path, and there's many places where innovations can drop off and fail and run into challenges. But I feel like we really headed off the first major point for University Innovator. So with that, I think we can go on to the questions for the panel.
Thank you, Augusta and Laura, for our insightful presentation. And you're right, I think there's more questions because you summed it up with the example of an innovator. And that's our next segment. I'll ask a few questions to our panelists about innovators and how the process was able to scale them. In the interest of time, moving on to the first question. In Powering Agriculture, the business acceleration model used a one-to-one portfolio manager model. Whereas in SWFF program, the acceleration work planning process identified the TA intervention and used 4 lines of support, including the rapid vendor procurement mechanism. I think my question would be that what are some of the pros and cons of each approach, because we see in both the programs that both of them worked. So we'll start with Kevin from SWFF.
Sure, thanks, Jatin. So I'd say overall, we were able to bring quite a breadth and depth of skills to the innovators through the lines of support. I'd say the biggest challenge was that there were more moving parts to manage and make sure that they work together. So one example was in setting expectations between the innovator and the vendor. So in the first year, we took a hands-off approach and intentionally let the support engagement run its course between the innovator and the support provider. And we did this with the idea that it would streamline communications. But at the end of the support engagement, innovators were kind of consistently giving us feedback that the deliverables were not meeting expectations, or that the vendor was not up to speed on background information, and so engagements were taking too long to get off the ground because of the vendor learning curve. So we had to address some process gaps that were leading to misunderstood expectations, and also preventing vendors from getting off to a fast start. So, part of the problem with the misaligned expectations was that we were trying to deliver support across a wide range of support areas with a consortium of only 3 vendors. And although they were good, they just couldn't be expected to meet the wide range of innovator needs. We were delivering over 20 different support types, and there just wasn't the expertise to deliver really well across all those types. So we shifted to an expanded vendor network using that RVPM model that we referred to earlier, and we were able to maintain a larger bench of vendors that brought more expertise, and many of these were actually based locally as well. So innovators were telling us that was important, so we were responsive to their needs. So by making some of these key shifts, we were able to improve from, in the first year, just 50% of support engagements meeting expectations to, by the end, 100% meeting expectations.
Great, thanks, Kevin. And Laura, would you want to shed some light on the pros and cons of a one-to-one portfolio manager model?
Yeah, sure. And I think I'm so curious about the model that you're speaking to, Kevin. So I think there are many lessons learned from both strategies. So in our case, one of the primary things that we were thinking about is the long-term arc of relationship between the portfolio manager and the innovator, and how to build that 3-year relationship as the TA provider. That, from our perspective, that long-term relationship allowed for continuity and observation of innovators' evolution of skills and experiences over time. So that also allowed for sort of a deep understanding of innovator decisions, and rather than kind of coming back with superficial insights, the innovator doesn't really want to do whatever was being recommended. We were able to really look deeply and know deeply that this innovator, for example, is not good at recognizing what needs to get done. And once they do, they will move more deeply into it. The other core principle in the work that we developed, or the strategy, was around a little bit of a, not necessarily like a firewall, but a little bit of a gap between our work with the innovator and the USAID team that was funding them. We're really interested in having some space to be able to work directly with innovators that allowed for us to let them open up a little bit about what their real challenges were, what their gaps were, and not necessarily as in a way that might potentially come back and harm the perception of their success on the award. So it was a little bit of a different strategy, very much focused on trying to avoid the technological road to nowhere, which we know, especially for that R&D portfolio, part of the portfolio, they can really get sort of trapped into the being really focused on the technology development piece.
Thanks, Laura. And I think that fits into the next question that I have, which is innovators and coachability, which is like very frequently talked about point. So my question is, what are some of the lessons learned regarding coachability of the innovators within your program? And this time I'll go with Dr. Koo from SWFF first, and then Laura.
Sure, and building on the last 2 points that Laura was talking about, SWFF did do a slightly different thing where USAID was, as one of the lines of support, was a bit more involved. But nonetheless, the key focus she was pointing on is the ability to have trust. And so if you don't have that trust, then it makes everything not work as well. And one of the ways in which you could build trust on both sides is when you have entrepreneurs and innovators who come in with, energy and enthusiasm, but also humility. And so a fundamental component of our technical assistance was the ability for innovators to work closely, intensively with us and be coachable, so that when they heard things that were not exactly what they were used to seeing, they would be able to pivot to grow. And in some cases, and especially in the first round of the program, we had many innovators who came in, had their view on what things should be, weren't very coachable, and then things would often fail. And literally, it was until things failed that they would be able to see that maybe they needed to change their position. And so as a result of what we learned from the first round, in our later rounds, coachability was actually something that both our external advisory committee was looking at, as well as our team in the application process. And there were a few applicants who had a strong innovation, even had a pretty good business model, but it was clear they weren't going to be coachable. And therefore, we knew that wouldn't be a good match for the program, because innovators can be quite overconfident about their own knowledge and may reject that advice. And this is really important to think about when you're going into a new market where you think you know things, but you don't. And so you have to be able to pivot to grow. With that, I turn it back over to Laura.
Yeah, I think this is such a critical point. And one thing that we see, in broadly in coaching innovator entrepreneurs is that balance, right? You need the confidence as an entrepreneur to forge ahead when things are tough and when everyone's telling you no, but you believe yes. The advice is always like, look, you're the entrepreneur, go for it. But you also need to combine that with some level of humility, as you were saying, Ku, and ability to listen to people who have expertise and experience that would be critical to your success. So as I was mentioning a minute ago, the Powering Ag Innovators represented a range of organizations. So we were working with, and I believe this is true across both programs, we were working with technology startups, established technology companies, consulting companies implementing development projects, large international NGOs wanting to introduce a new technology to a market, university-based innovators and researchers that are piloting technology prototypes in the field. So the myriad of innovator motivations was something that we wanted to take really into close consideration. Not everybody in the portfolio was looking for business acceleration support, right? So if they were a technologist and they just kind of wanted to work on their widget, they were a little resistant oftentimes to getting this kind of technical assistance, whereas others had really kind of, in some cases, people hadn't even really examined their own personal motivations. It's kind of that build it and they will come mindset. So in one case, we had a PAEGC portfolio manager who spent several weeks with an innovator providing on-site business acceleration support in country. Leading up to the visit, the portfolio manager provided introductions and referrals, and it was a lot of advice or work on the side of the portfolio manager. The innovator later just completely failed to follow up on any of the technical assistance, and we made the decision to move away from working with that innovator. It wasn't worth us sort of pushing. And then by contrast, we've had other innovators where on-site TA turned very quickly into investor pitches and connections with investors. So we've seen both sides of that work through.
Great, and I know that gender integration has been a very important point for both the programs. So my next question would be, how did SWFF and Powering Ag integrate gender in the technical assistance process with respect to overall business case? And what were some of the challenges and success? And maybe this time Powering Ag team, Augusta can go first.
Thanks, Jatin. So first, I'd like to emphasize that the thinking around gender and gender integration evolved a lot over the course of Powering Agriculture. We were one of the first grand challenges to get started, either like the second or the third that USDA ran. And in the beginning, I'm not even sure it was a selection criteria. And then later it was added as a selection criteria. But our thinking changed a lot over the course of running the Grand Challenge. Eventually, we introduced on-demand gender technical assistance, and we found this to be quite effective, especially with the innovators that were already scaling up. And she was called upon, our gender technical assistance provider was called upon to provide inputs into developing some of their marketing strategies and assessment strategies. But in many cases, innovators were very focused on, the ones that were focused on developing a technology, if they were focused on understanding why their controller wasn't maximizing the output of their solar panel, they weren't really thinking about gender right at that moment. And so we eventually found that that innovators really needed approaches that aligned with their practical challenges and business strategies on the ground. And they didn't have the bandwidth to necessarily go out and figure out what those were themselves. They were all, I mean, everyone was interested in gender. They thought the goals of gender equity was a good idea, but it was, you know, they're also thinking about how to create a sustainable business. And so by being able to bring these approaches to the innovators, they demonstrate more willingness to uptake the intervention. So one example, for instance, is we introduced an empowerment training that has been shown to be very beneficial to especially women sales operators in the field. And so through this training, so then we had several innovators that participated in this training and were very excited about it and we're rolling it out. But I think it just shows that by showing them practical approaches, that's the way we were really best able to get uptake of our gender-based interventions. SWFF.
Thanks. And so, you know, Augusta hit on some really key points there. And SWFF, from its beginning, we came a little bit later than Powering Act. So we broadly supported the notion that you should integrate women and gender equity into SWFF Innovators operations, marketing, and technology adoption, and felt that engaging and empowering both men and women in a fair and equitable manner would create lasting benefit. That was one of the things that our partner CETA came in with the early and the onset. But as Augusta said, there's a big difference between this policy advocacy space and practical things that help businesses. And I think as a program, we didn't fully understand that at first, and it took us some time to get to that. And so, Kevin, I'll turn that over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Ku. I think our pivoted approach reflects the lesson learned that Augusta was talking about in practicality. So at first, most of our gender support was coming through workshops on gender integration that were generally held at our annual convenings. But you know, we did this with the idea that this would be an efficient way to teach these best practices. But in reality, these workshops were poorly reviewed, and because the gender recommendations just weren't tailored to an innovator's market and cultural circumstances. So we pivoted to provide one-on-one support that was more targeted to the individual innovator, and this led to more practical approaches and solutions and achievable goals. And for example, gender components were incorporated into each scope of work regardless of the primary focus. So a scope of work that was intended to create a sales and marketing strategy would also include an assessment of how the product or service should be pitched differently to a female customer segment versus a male customer segment, if there were differences in how those two segments would view the value proposition, for example.
Thanks, Kevin. And moving on to the next question, I think the SWFF portfolio leaned towards market expansion, whereas Powering Act portfolio was a combination of early stage R&D innovations. So how did this inform the TA model for each program? I think that would be interesting to know. So I'll start with Laura first.
Sure, yeah, and I think I mentioned this earlier. So VentureWells has about 25 years of experience working with early stage innovators taking lab to market. And so for us, that spans lab-based researchers, so really at that R&D part, part of the pathway, all the way up to early stage commercialization, which is generally focused on Series A investment. So that's sort of the span of where our expertise lies. And one of the things we know is a common challenge with these early stage innovators is they can be trapped in the dungeon of their discipline. And my friend Michael Free, who was the founder of PATH, actually named that. And I think it's a brilliant sort of analogy. So they tend to focus on technology development at the expense of other important metrics. And we looked at that framework earlier today. So you know sort of the breadth of how we think about the support that we need to provide. Generally we find it can be very challenging to coach these early stage innovators because they may not have thought about or perhaps not even have accepted the need to develop a commercialization plan or a go-to-market strategy. So the technologists, frequently think that customers will intuitively see the value in a technology, and once they've developed it or have built it, it's kind of like a build it and they will come mindset. Whereas the later stage innovators generally have accepted the need for product commercialization plan. They understand the need to develop, all the facets of the venture team that we looked at earlier in that framework. So we worked to try to bridge the difference between these two innovators by working through those portfolio managers who brought expertise in to specialize their TA along the two innovator groups. So for the early stage innovators, we were really talking about ways to attract non-dilutive capital, justifying commercialization, asking them to look deeply at their own interest in being part of that commercialization strategy. Then for the later stage innovators, really looking, focusing deeply on the preparation for, and then, the attracting the larger check sizes and expansion out of their current market. So, really it was sort of a combination of efforts, but that tried to address innovators as meet them where they are. Kevin or Ku?
Yes, and so on that point, I completely agree. It's about the processes, but it's also about the starting point. And so our plan and our process of bringing in innovators and the question and answer period, both the written questions, you can learn a lot about people from what they write, but it's what they say that's often most important. So with our finalists, we had an interaction between the finalists and our Innovation Investment Advisory Committee. So they could be looked at from a financial, a social, and an environmentally sustainable perspective, as well as a technical perspective. And you could kind of go beneath the surface and kind of unearth some things. And so because of that and our focus on things and the business models that were a little bit further down the pipe, we were able to move people along a little bit more. And I think that was a slight difference in the programs. So having them have to prove the viability of the innovation before they came into the program and have a minimum customer end user set allowed us to work a little bit further down the pipe. And Kevin, I'll turn it over to you for how we did so.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Ku. Yeah, so I think that starting point that Ku mentioned is really important. We actually kind of divided the kinds of support that we delivered kind of between foundational or first level support and second level support, what we called second level support. And foundational is really about did the innovator really understand their customer, or had they really tested their business model yet? So we had what ended up being kind of even close to packaged support delivery when it came to helping design a customer survey or gathering customer data and helping to analyze it for insights, for example, or helping them with a business model canvas exercise. That second level support would really get into support that was dependent upon having those foundations in place. So developing a sales and marketing strategy or partnering strategies, market expansion planning, these sorts of things. So, we were able to kind of tier our support between foundational and the more kind of second tier support for those that were further along.
Okay. Thanks, Kevin. And I think we have 3 minutes and 2 more questions. Actually, so many questions, but this one is for the SWFF team. How did you ensure that the best suited experts were selected to work with innovators, and what was the innovators say in the process? Yeah,
this is an interesting kind of lesson learned for us. In the early years, the innovator was not involved at all in the selection of the vendor that would deliver support to them. We as the TA facility would conduct the needs assessment, would have the scoping conversation, would draft the scope of work, and then review RFP responses and select the highest scoring vendor. But later on, we found that it was important to make 2 specific pivots to our approach. So first, we, as we've discussed earlier, we really focused on bringing on local vendors, which is something that innovators were requesting more broadly. And then in the second pivot was really about allowing the innovator to have skin in the game as far as who they were going to work with. So we would go through kind of a filter process of getting down to the top 2 or sometimes 3 highest scoring vendors, and then would let the innovator actually have an interview with each of them to determine from their perspective, who brought the most relevant technical experience and business expertise to help them solve their problem, and would be the easiest to work with, really, who they would enjoy working with most. So we found that it was really important to give them some skin in the game and give them a choice in that as well. Ku, do you have anything to add?
Well, I'd just say that, overall that really worked. That unmet expectations significantly went down. The innovators were much happier. But every once in a while, things didn't work, and that's just going to be a part of the process when you're doing technical assistance and working in partnership. Back to you, John.
Thanks, Gu. And this last one is for Augusta and Laura. With respect to investment facilitation support, there was an investment alliance empowering ag. So could you comment on the respective approach and why these programs like prepared and how you prepared innovators for fundraising within the program or in future?
Yeah, so I previously alluded to the Powering Agriculture Investment Alliance, and we talked a lot about the venture well model around supporting investment facilitation. But I was really excited with the development of this model in the Powering Agriculture Investment Alliance because I think it solves two birds with one stone. So in this model, the investors themselves have a capacity to provide the technical assistance. So we're channeling the funding as donors, we're supporting them, we're providing the funding for them to provide technical assistance. And I think this does two things. One is investing in these early stage companies is really labor intensive for them, and it cuts into their profit margins, and these are already high risk companies, and so having that early way to get in to know a company, and it starts to buy down actually some of the risk because they're able to get involved early, understand the team through a low risk engagement, get invested, and by that I mean like emotionally and intellectually invested in what the company is doing, and do this before they have had to put in their own investment dollars. And then but they're also in partnership with us, incentivize they're bound to, in their word, to mobilize a certain amount of follow-on financing. And so they're motivated to make good choices, to find the best companies. And so I think it really helps to be involved with these impact investors early on and deliver technical assistance with them in a coordinated way that allows them to engage and learn about the innovators from the beginning. So I'll end there because I know we want to go ahead and take some audience questions as well.
So, okay, Jatin, you want to bring up the question, or should I? Okay, well, in the interest of time, one of the questions was, why was the policy and advocacy TA support rated so low by the innovators? What are some lessons learned to improve policy and advocacy support? And this, I think, is directed at SWFF because I think it was a rating of 2 on our slide. The reality was, when we started the program, one of our parts of the theory of change was the other parts of the U.S. government and the missions and embassies of the donors were going to work on the policy and advocacy space because they were local. And so we basically thought, well, we could turn our innovators over to them, and then they'll help the innovators do that. And in some cases, in some ad hoc ways, it worked. But in most cases, that was a bad strategy. And so what we realized for We for Food is that has to be an integral part of what the program itself does, and we can't depend on our missions and embassies because they're already overworked and overloaded with their existing workloads. And so we need to, kind of facilitate that process a lot more. So that was, I think, one of the key lessons there. Jatin?
Thanks, Gu. And I think one other question is, how do you draw the line on aspects which the firms need to do themselves and evolve internally? And I think what versus what can be provided through an external TA, because not everything can be provided in external TA. So I think this one is interesting.
Sure, I'll just talk on it, and then Laura and Kevin. So for us, what we learned is you got to teach somebody how to fish sometimes, that they may not have the internal capacity to even know what's missing. And so once you show, here's how you do a market strategy, here's how you reach out and get customer feedback, here's how you look for new market channels, and then give them a training, then they can go and do that on their own. But Laura?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think the key to that being successful in the context of a program like this is building out a mechanism by which you can make those pivots. And Koo spoke really, Koo and Kevin have talked about some of those major pivots they made along the way, at the program design and how they were supporting innovators. And I would say that for the Powering Ag team, it was very similar. We wanted to create an opportunity to get to know the innovators, to understand what their bigger challenges were, and then to have the flexibility to go deep when we saw that the innovators were coachable, that there was a real interest in the partnership with the TA providers, and then we were able to sort of build in more deeply as we moved through getting to know folks. But I totally agree, Koo. There's so much of that teach a person to fish mindset that you need to start with.
Just to jump on that, I would say that in our the support that we delivered, we emphasized, kind of equipping the innovator to be able to do it for themselves in the future. So a lot of our scopes of work, the deliverables were built in. We built in a kind of an implementation guide, project plans, templates, and so forth that we could equip the innovator to then kind of do repeatable processes for themselves in the future. We tried to make the advice that we provided, recommendations that we provided, very practical, so that the innovator can then carry forward on their own and weren't dependent on somebody from the outside.
And just on that point, just want to make a plug for the Base of the Pyramid workbook with some practical strategies for innovators to do some of the things. So we kind of compiled those things that we were teaching our innovators and put it out for the public, and it's on our website.
Thanks, Koo. I think there's one more question on how large of a challenge were technology problems, and were you able to collect data on technology performance? Augusta?
Yes, so I think what I'd like to say about this is that we didn't collect information on this numerically, but in some ways the technology problems never end. And the temptation with our innovators is to keep on working on the technology forever. A lot of them were technologists themselves, and I think and so in some ways felt most comfortable just when dealing with the technology. The challenge is really, how do you get started with a minimum viable product that you can start to learn about the market, how the market reacts to that technology and responds to it. The technologies can almost always be improved. They can be introduced at a lower price point. They can be, a pump can be made more powerful, more targeted, et cetera, But how does an innovator get started with a minimum viable product and build a business up around it? I think that was really the key that we saw, that innovators had to work to take that next step, and that was in some cases challenging.
Great, thanks, Augusta. And I think I'll take one more question. So how did those that entered as research and development fare in your program? Because I know both the program had idea stage, early stage innovators.
So in short, not well. You can go back to the external evaluations for both programs and they speak to that. But yeah, usually it's working on a market and figuring out how to scale is a big enough problem. And if you don't have a good technology already, then it's probably not going to work.
Yeah, and I think the only addition I will make to that is going back to where we started today around the theory of change, and often the grand challenges mindset and where the grand challenges started 15 years ago was a push to pull, or sort of a pull for the scientific community to get more involved in solving global challenges. And I think if you think about it from that perspective, and you look across all the grand challenges over the years, then we have absolutely seen a pull, from the scientific community to want to be involved in these issues. And if you're looking at it purely and only from a commercialization outcomes standpoint, I would agree with you, Koo. If you're asking yourself sort of to look more broadly at how the scientific community has gained an interest in these issues, then I would say that we've got some gains there.
Agreed.
And if I just might add,
oh, go ahead, Augusta.
say one last thing on the point is that we're also dealing with an issue of timeframes here. So how and what is our definition of success in the case of early stage R&D? So for instance, we had one innovator that started with developing a pump and testing it in the field, and then there was a follow-on award to actually commercialize it. And so it really needed the full 6 years. Actually, it's been more like 8 years at this point to get to a more stage of commercialization. And so it's just important to recall the time scales. So in 3 years, maybe not much, but in 10 years, maybe something can happen.
Yeah, and on that point, hopefully the audience can see it from the context of development. So for us, our focus is around impact on people and communities. And so if it's something, and we also have taxpayers we're responsible to. So if it's something that's going to take 20 or 30 years, we need to work with other partners who have a longer time horizon, who can invest at that time scale, whereas we need to invest on a little bit of a shorter time scale so we can help people who have more immediate needs.
Great. Thanks a lot, everyone. I wish we had more time for questions, but once again, a huge thank you to our gender balanced panel that we had today. And I also want to take a moment to thank all of you who have joined us today and participated in submitting questions. For the remaining questions we didn't have an opportunity to answer today, we'll upload those responses on our website. Lastly, we invite you to join us for the closing session, new program, new solutions, water and energy for foods path forward, starting in 15 minutes. Thanks a lot. Goodbye, everyone.